Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You might imagine the founding of Rome as a clash of warriors, a city birthed by steel and ambition. That's how it's told in the grand versions, the triumphal myths of Romulus and Remus, of wolves and swords and kings. But there's another figure, almost entirely erased, who stands in the shadows of this origin story. Hercilia, the wife of Romulus, and, perhaps, the first queen of Rome. You've probably never heard her name. That, too, is part of the story. She appears in the margins, occasionally and reluctantly, as if the chroniclers weren't sure whether to remember her at all. But let's go back to the beginning, not to Romulus. Not yet, but to the Sabines. Before Rome had walls, it had a problem of people, specifically a lack of women. Romulus, fresh from founding his new settlement, had gathered a ragtag group of outlaws, shepherds, and fugitives. They were eager to build, to fight, to belong, but they were missing something essential for the survival of any city: wives. There were few, if any, women among the settlers, and the surrounding tribes were suspicious. No one wanted to give their daughters to a city built by criminals, so Romulus devised a plan, one that became legend and later embarrassment. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, a feast of games, music, and wine. The Sabines came, bringing their daughters and wives, and settled in among the celebrations. Then, at a signal, the Romans seized the Sabine women and drove the men out. This event is remembered, controversially, as the rape of the Sabine women, though in Latin the word raptio meant abduction, not sexual violence. Still, the trauma of that moment was real. A trick dressed as a festival, a beginning dressed as a betrayal, and in the days that followed, Rome grew, not by invitation, but by force. But here's the part that seldom gets told. After the abduction, the women stayed, and after they stayed, they began to shape the city from the inside, and it's in this moment that Hercilia begins to appear. We don't know much about her origin. Some accounts say she was a Sabine noblewoman. Others say she was Roman from the beginning, but all agree on one thing: she became Romulus's wife, not through choice, not through courtship, but through politics. And it's what she did next that made her unforgettable. Even if history preferred to forget her in the months that followed the abduction, the Sabine men prepared for war. Led by King Titus Tatius, the Sabines launched a campaign against Rome to retrieve their daughters and sisters. The battle was fierce. Roman soil had barely settled before it was stained with blood. Shields clashed, javelins flew, and the Tiber saw its first taste of organized war. Then, in the middle of this chaos, a strange thing happened. The Sabine women ran into the battlefield, not with weapons, but with open arms. Hercilia was among them, clad in veils and woven tunics. These women, once abducted, now reluctant Roman wives, placed themselves between their husbands and their fathers, and they begged them to stop. Here's what Livy, the Roman historian, later wrote: with loosened hair and torn garments, they ran between the lines. They prayed their fathers not to kill their husbands, nor their husbands their fathers, that they, the cause of the war, would rather die themselves than see such bloodshed. And so, in a war of men, it was women, led by Hercilia, who brought peace. A truce was declared. The two peoples merged. Romulus and Titus Tatius ruled jointly for a time. And the Sabine women became the first mothers of Roman unity. It's an extraordinary moment. A moment of diplomacy, not conquest. And it hinged on a woman whose name barely appears in the annals. What does it mean to be remembered in this way, to appear only when others fight, and then disappear once the war is over. Hersilia, after brokering the truce, fades once again from the record. Some say she became the queen of the newly unified Rome. Others suggest she was honored as a priestess or matron, but no formal title was ever preserved. No law, no statue. In Roman lore, kings were often deified. Romulus, it was said, became the god Quirinus, ascending to the heavens in a chariot of light. The people mourned his death and worshipped his divinity. And Hersilia, she too, was said to have been taken into the heavens, transformed into a goddess called Hora, or sometimes Hersilia, the star, but only in the quiet footnotes of later poets. Her divine story was smaller, less sung, and much more uncertain. No temple was built in her name, no feast day established. Just a whisper that she was there once, at the beginning. The early Roman historians, Livy, Plutarch, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, all wrote of her, but only briefly. Plutarch noted her wisdom and her ability to calm the rage of men. Livy gave her a few lines during the abduction crisis. Dionysius suggested she was the daughter of Hostus Hostilius, making her of noble Roman stock. But none of them gave her a voice. She is acted upon, never acting, married, abducted, positioned, remembered always, through others. So, we're left to imagine her daily life in a city of half-built walls, under a thatched roof near the Palatine Hill, walking among stone paths still drying from construction. She might have woken early, fetching water from the spring of Judena. She might have embroidered ceremonial garments, prepared herbs for childbirth, or sat beside Romulus as he reviewed reports from the new tribes. She would have known the wives of the senators, the children of the Sabine warriors. She would have spoken multiple dialects and helped blend two cultures, not through policy, but through household routines, shared recipes, and quiet habits passed from woman to woman. And yet, we hear none of her words. The men wrote laws. She wrote peace. The men carved their names in marble. She carved a city in the space between families. And then she disappeared, or was made to. How many queens like her have vanished? How many stood at the hinge of a war and a truce, only to be folded into myth or a footnote? Rome, as it grew, preferred to remember its kings, its consuls, its generals. But who raised their children? Who wove the families together? Taught them when to stop fighting? And why were their names lost? The Roman Republic, when it finally emerged, centuries after the reign of Romulus, would make a ritual of remembering its founders. Every street, every temple, every gate bore a name. Names of generals, consuls, tribunes, and gods. The forum echoed with speeches about the valor of ancestors, with each orator claiming descent from the great. Romulus was invoked constantly. Even the wolf that nursed him had statues in her honor. But Hersilia's name grew quieter with time, until even the echoes forgot her. And yet, it wasn't entirely erased, like water seeping into cracks. Her presence endured, not in the monuments or the laws, but in the domestic rituals and half-remembered festivals of Roman women. And in those spaces, she held more power than we often think. Because Rome wasn't just built on swords. It was built in kitchens, courtyards, and shrines to household gods, spaces that were Hersilia's domain. After the unification of the Sabines and the Romans, the settlement expanded rapidly. The Palatine and Capitoline hills, once wild and dotted with grazing flocks, filled with the hum of stonework, hearth, smoke, and trade. Markets emerged. Wells were dug deeper. Houses transformed from huts into brick-faced domes, with atriums and lararia, household altars. And with these changes came customs, quiet customs, women's customs. No records survive that tell us how Hersilia structured her household. But clues emerge if you read slowly between the lines of later Roman women's practices. In the way a Roman matron greeted visitors with water and olive oil. In the way she marked the calends, nones, and ides, not with politics, but with kitchen rhythms and prayers to Vesta. Historians now believe that many of these traditions were not Roman in origin. They were Sabine, passed down from the abducted wives who chose, or were forced, to stay. And Hersilia, as Romulus's wife and the highest status woman in early Rome, would have been the one to blend them, to make them Roman. She wasn't given a throne, but she was given the responsibility of peacekeeping, of cultural translation, of healing, not just in war, but in marriage. It was a political act to light a hearth, to name a child after both a Roman and Sabine ancestor, to prepare a meal with ingredients from both traditions. This was Hersilia's revolution. Quiet, daily, enduring. Still, even these small victories didn't ensure memory. There was a moment, fleeting but notable, when the poets tried to bring her back. In the 1st century BCE, the poet Ovid wrote of Hersilia in his epic Metamorphoses. But he did not describe her as a woman of reason or diplomacy. He described her as a grieving widow. Romulus had, according to myth, vanished into a storm, swept up into the heavens, and made divine. In Ovid's telling, Hersilia wept for him. Then the goddess Juno appeared to her and whispered that her husband now lived among the stars. In that moment, Hersilia was lifted to the skies herself, transformed into a goddess named Hora. But even in this elevation, she was not named for what she did. She was named for whom she loved. Even in becoming divine, she was secondary, a reflection of Romulus's glory, not the architect of peace. Ovid's version isn't malicious, but it's Tellinga. Woman is remembered only through her tears, through the man she mourns. Her actions, stopping a war, merging two nations, fade into backstory, and yet in her transformation into Hora, something slips through. The goddess's name, Hora, evokes time, rhythm, the turning of seasons. In some Latin texts, it also refers to ours, to the patterns of the day. Could this be a whisper that Hersilia once shaped Rome's calendar, or its early rites of timing and order? We don't know, but even the suggestion is enough to wonder. What did she actually leave behind? And how far into Roman life did her quiet structures ripple? In the Roman household, the mater familias, the mother of the family, was the keeper of traditions. She ran the home, directed the slaves, oversaw the education of young children, and managed the religious obligations to the Lares and Penates, the household gods. This was no minor task. Roman religion was built on order, on precision, and the domestic cult was its foundation. The sacrifice was performed incorrectly. It had to be redone. If the wrong words were said at a hearth ceremony, the entire ritual lost its meaning. Hersilia would have overseen these details. She would have known which herbs to burn, which prayers to whisper, which days required fasting or celebration. And in doing so, she would have shaped not just one household, but all that came after. The customs she passed on, likely through women, not books, would have migrated through generations. You can almost imagine a Roman girl, a century later, scolding her grandmother why the hearth must be swept before sundown on a particular festival. And the grandmother, shrugging slightly, saying, because that's how the queen did it. The queen. No name, just the queen. A whisper of Hersilia, still flickering like a flame on the hearth. But why didn't the historians write more? Why didn't Livy or Tacitus, or even Plutarch, grant her the dignity of a fuller record? Part of the answer lies in how Roman history was written and who wrote it. Almost all surviving Roman histories were penned by men, many of them aristocrats or members of senatorial families. Their focus was public life, battles, treaties, speeches in the Senate. Domestic life, the work of women, was considered unimportant. It's ordinary for inclusion. The early years of Rome, mythologized and political, left little room for subtlety. Founders had to be bold. Warriors, lawgivers, kings, women who built peace through compromise were not dramatic enough. There's also the discomfort of the abduction story. Roman writers revered Romulus, but the founding myth carried a stain, a moment of treachery against their neighbors. So what's easier to blame, passion or necessity? To focus on what came after, not what was taken. To center the men and marginalize the women. And so, Piva Hercilia's triumph. Stopping a war was awkward. It had to be framed carefully. She didn't lead. She pleaded. She didn't strategize. She wept. But the truth, perhaps, was more complex. Hercilia may have been political, may have convinced the women to act together, may have used her position as Romulus's wife to pressure him into peace, may have played the battlefield not with tears, but with timing. But that story didn't fit the mold, so it faded. There's one final place where she appears, quietly, directly, in the form of architecture. In the Roman Forum stands a building called the Regia, the king's house. Originally, it was the residence of the early kings of Rome. Later, it became a religious site, the seat of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. Behind the Regia stood a small, rarely mentioned structure, the Domus Sacerdotalis, the house of the Vestal Virgin's overseer. The proximity between the king's house and this sacred domestic site may not be accidental. Some scholars believe the earliest Vestal cult, dedicated to Vesta, goddess of the hearth, may have been organized in part by the Sabine women after their union with Rome. That would make Hercilia not just a queen, but one of the founders of Rome's oldest religious institution. It would mean she helped write the calendar, shape the rituals, laid the rhythm of Roman life. And still, guess she has no temple, no known burial, no statue standing in the Forum, but her name lives faintly on dot in the constellation of myths, Kate in the footnotes of poets, Kate in the habits of women who swept the thresholds of Roman homes before the sun set on festival days. She may not have carved laws or conquered cities, but she ended a war with a sentence, and for that, Rome endured. There are many names etched in stone across Rome. Romulus has a hill. Numa has laws. Tarquin has a scandal. The emperors, hundreds of them, have arches, busts, inscriptions, and marble narratives, climbing walls like ivy. For Hercilia, Rome's first queen, there is only a silence, dignified, persistent, and strangely hard to erase. And yet, silence is not absence. Not in Rome, in ancient cities. History survives, not only in what was written or carved, but in what people continued to do without ever stopping to ask why. A gesture at the hearth, the way a wedding veil is tied, a small offering placed on a stone. Rome was filled with such gestures, passed from mother to daughter, wife to niece, midwife to girl in training. And when historians failed to record these gestures, it wasn't because they didn't matter. It was because they happened in kitchens, not courts, in doorways, not debates. They were Hercilia's legacy, and legacies like hers do not crumble. They simply recede into the mortar. In the early Republic, long after the death of Romulus, the story of Hercilia began to fade from state memory. The new Rome, governed by consuls, guided by the Senate, and driven by military expansion, had little patience for matriarchs. It needed war heroes and legal architects, needed the 12 tables, the triumphal marches, the myth of self-sacrificing fathers and soldier sons. But within homes, the Domas women still spoke her name, not loudly, not always directly, while she lingered. The matron who helped end a war by holding her ground between armies, the woman who walked between two hills, one Roman, one Sabine, and made them one dot in a culture obsessed with lineage and ancestry. Such a figure should have been claimed by every family seeking prestige, but Hercilia remained strangely, unclaimed. Perhaps that was her power. She didn't belong to a single gens or patrician house. she belonged to no one, and therefore to everyone. Centuries later, during the reign of Augustus, a revival of founding myths swept through Roman art and literature. The emperor, eager to cast his rule as the climax of Rome's divine destiny, encouraged poets and sculptors to retell the old stories. Romulus and Remus, the she-wolf, the founding of the city. It was an opportunity, perhaps the last for Acilia's story to resurface in full, and for a brief moment, it did. A few frescoes, now mostly lost to time, depicted a veiled woman between two kings. A marble relief, long thought to be generic, was reinterpreted by one antiquarian as showing Acilia raising her hand to command peace. But even in this rebirth, she was not center stage. She was background, a silhouette beside greatness, a necessary but narratively inconvenient figure. What did it mean for the glorious founding of Rome if the bloodshed stopped because a woman said enough? It didn't fit the myth of conquest, so she was allowed to fade once more. Still, faint fingerprints of Ercilia remain. One of the most persistent is not a statue or inscription, but a festival, the Matron Lea, held on the calends of March. The Matronalia honored Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth and women's transition into motherhood. But unlike other Roman festivals, this one wasn't led by priests or senators. It was celebrated in the home. Husbands gave gifts to their wives. Children offered prayers to their mothers. Slaves were granted rest, if only for a day. Some scholars believe that the roots of the Matronalia are tied not to Juno directly, but to the peace that followed the Sabine War. That is, to Acilia and the Sabine women who stopped bloodshed and established harmony. In this reading, the Matronalia wasn't just a celebration of fertility, it was a political ritual, a reminder that women built Rome's first peace, that in a city of sorts. It was softness that first bound the city together, and that at least once a year. Roman men owed their wives more than silence. They owed them acknowledgement. It's telling that the Matronalia survived for centuries, even as Ercilia's name did not dot the gesture outlived the story. There's something uniquely Roman about this selective memory. Rome remembered what served the moment, what justified its power, its order, its ambitions, and so it remembered Romulus, the sword, the storm, the throne, but it forgot that none of those things meant anything without the moment he lowered his arm and listened. Listened to a woman. Listened to Hersilia. It's possible, of course, that even that story was a later invention, a retroactive insertion of peace into a myth of war, that there was no singular Hercilia, that she was a composite of many women, voices layered across time, pressed into the shape of a queen because history needed one. But whether Hercilia was a person or a parable, her presence matters, because what is Rome without its silences, without its unsung architects, without the shadows between columns? Today, tourists walk the Roman Forum unaware of how many names are missing. They see statues of Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan. They marvel at the arches, the temples, the imperial echoes. But if you walk slowly, especially near the Regia or the Temple of Vesta, you'll find spaces where stories cling to corners, where no name is carved, but something lingers in the ruins of a private altar, in the layout of a hearth, in the trace of footsteps that once circled a fire before dawn. These were Hercilia's domains, not the Senate house, not the battlefield, but the in-between, the places where cities are truly built, not with decrees, but with decisions repeated daily. For generations, we will likely never know where she was buried. Unlike Romulus, who was said to have ascended to the heavens or been interred beneath the Comitium, Hercilia left no grand tomb. Perhaps she was laid to rest quietly near the Sabine hill where she was born. Perhaps her ashes were scattered near the hearth of her home. Or perhaps, in keeping with her mythic ending, she too vanished into the clouds, not to become a goddess, but to become invisible and therefore enduring. Because sometimes, to be forgotten by history is to be spared its distortions, and in that forgetting, there is a kind of preservation, a quiet truth. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think not of kings or conquests. Think of a woman standing alone between two armies. Think of her not pleading, but reasoning, not weeping, but calculating, not yielding, holding. She saw what the men could not, that war would only leave widows. And that peace was the only way forward. She had no sword, no title, no official record, but she had a voice, and for one moment, long enough to change everything, it was heard. Would Rome have endured without her, or would it have burned early in its own pride? We can't say for sure, but we do know this. Even cities as loud as Rome depend on their quiet corners, and even emperors walk on streets first swept by women. When you walk along the canals of Ravenna, the silence can feel almost orchestrated, as if the city, so soaked in mosaic and memory, is waiting for someone to ask the right question. The stones don't shout, they suggest, they remember. And among those memories, one name lingers not in the carvings, but between them, where the dust of forgotten minds has settled thick. Her name was Caelia. No records confirm it beyond a fragmentary inscription in a cracked codex cover. But that name, Caelia, has surfaced more than once in the footnotes of obscure medieval treatises. Always in relation to someone else, never at the center, just a teacher, a scribe, a silent facilitator, and yet, those who know where to look find her shadow everywhere, not as a martyr, not as a nun, but as a mind, a girl whose ink-stained fingers taught the boy who would become Pope Gregory II how to write, how to question, and, perhaps most dangerously, how to imagine. Let us go back to the early 8th century, to Ravenna in the year 705, to a stone house with no windows, where a girl dipped her quill in a mixture of lamp soot and vinegar, and scratched out letters on parchment not meant to bear her name at the time. Ravenna was a strange city, Byzantine in spirit, Roman in structure, and quietly rebellious in tone. Once the capital of the Western Roman Empire in its final days, it had become a kind of cultural corridor, connecting Constantinople's theology with the Latin West's politics. Within its walls, language mattered. So did form. So did obedience, at least on the surface. Girls were not formally taught to read, but the children of scribes sometimes learned by accident. Callia's father, Lucius, was one of those scribes. He was a second-tier copyist employed by the exarchs, chancery. His job was to transcribe imperial decrees, clerical correspondence, and, occasionally, theological debates between Constantinople and Rome. It was dull work, precise, repetitive, but it paid enough for bread. Cute. In one afternoon, as Lucius rested with a cloth over his eyes, Callia crept to his desk and began copying the shape of an alpha. Just its shape, then the beta, then whole words. Within weeks, she was correcting his lines. Within months, she was writing her own. Lucius noticed and said nothing. He only left more parchment out in the evenings, and once, without comment, he gave her a new quill tip, honed flat for elegance. It was their quiet pact by age 10. Callia had memorized sections of the Psalms, not for prayer, but for rhythm. She was not interested in salvation, at least not in the prescribed sense. She was interested in syntax, where words bent, where they breathed, where the rules failed to hold. She also watched the visitors who came to the chancery courtyard. Traders from Alexandria, monks from Cyprus, students from Rome. Some of them, upon seeing her read or write, offered polite disapproval. Others whispered admiration. A few, particularly the Greek scholars, encouraged her father with quiet nods, but no one interfered. Not yet then. One rainy spring morning, a boy was sent to the scriptorium for lessons. His name was Gregorios. His mother had died His father, a Roman official, had been recalled to the capital, and the boy, half Latin and half Greek, was left in Ravenna under the supervision of an uncle, a deacon with ambitions far exceeding his clerical rank. The deacon believed in two things: alliances and literacy. He wanted the boy trained in both. Lucius was assigned a task, but when Lucius fell ill, Callia stepped in, just for a day, then another, then the rest of the year. Gregorios was clever, but impatient. He scribbled, he fidgeted, questioned too quickly, but Callia didn't scold him. She offered puzzles, hidden words, secret phrases buried in texts, games of linguistic inversion. She showed him how to read a passage forwards and backwards, how to recognize which sentences were planted as traps, how some prayers were written, not for the faithful, but for the fearful tools of control rather than devotion. And the boy listened. He asked questions, dangerous ones. Why did God change his mind? In Genesis. Why did the apostles write 4 stories and not 1? Why did the bishops say one thing in Latin and another in Greek? Callia never told him to stop. She only showed him where to look deeper. By his 12th year, Gregorios was transcribing arguments from Origen, copying refutations of Arianism, and translating psalms from both tongues. When asked where he'd learned it, he'd say, simply, from the scribe's daughter. No one believed him, but they should have, in the margins of one surviving tract attributed to a young Gregory II. Still, in his early days as an acolyte, there is a phrase scrawled in tiny, slanted script. The girl taught me how to read between what is written and what is meant. It is unsigned, but several PayPal archivists, centuries later, would note its unusual phrasing. It's more poetic than theological. Some even speculated it came from a woman's hand, but the Vatican never confirmed this, nor did it need to by the time Gregory II ascended to the papacy in 715. The girl who had taught him to think like a writer was already gone from the records. She had not died. She had simply stopped being mentioned, which, for a woman in that time, meant much the same thing. So what happened? What silenced Callia was not scandal, nor exile, nor illness. It was something more mundane: visibility. By her 15th year, her reputation, quiet but steady, had begun to outpace the patience of the church officials in Ravenna. Rumors swirled of a girl who knew theology better than monks, who annotated imperial decrees, who taught boys who would wear might. It was not the teaching that bothered them, it was the implication that she had something original to say. And so, one evening, Lucius received a polite but final request from the bishop's office. Callia was not to copy scripture, not to translate letters, not to teach. She could read, but only for herself. The message was simple: stay invisible, or disappear. Lucius complied. He burned her latest manuscripts in the brazier. Callia said nothing. She only stopped writing for others and turned to writing for no one. In a small collection of parchments now held in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, there is a set of anonymous notes written in a dialect that fuses Greek syntax with the Latin script, a rare and clever mixture. Among the notes are musings on astronomy, odd calendrical discrepancies, and even a poetic fragment about language. In silence, the fragment reads, "The tongue carves shape from silence, but the hand preserves what the tongue cannot bear." It is unsigned, but its ink is soot and vinegar. Its letters curve in a style nearly identical to that found in Lucius's earliest copies. One paleographer, in 1963, proposed that the entire bundle was the work of a single woman, possibly Callia. Her hypothesis was dismissed as romantic speculation, but those who've compared the letter forms say otherwise. And as for Gregory, he never named her again, not in public, not in any of his surviving writings, but his papacy, defined by its tension with imperial authority and its emphasis on textual integrity, bore the marks of someone who had been taught not just to obey text, but to interrogate it. Under his leadership, church documents became more precise, less ambiguous. He demanded scribes annotate their sources. He emphasized translation accuracy. He even quietly funded women's convent libraries across central Italy, especially in Ravenna. He never said why, but perhaps he didn't need to. Perhaps, in building those libraries, he was returning a favor. And yet, why was Kalia never acknowledged? Why did the boy she taught, the pope she shaped, never utter her name once he wore the robe? Was it fear? Or was it strategy? Was it gratitude, masked by protection? Or simply the pattern of history, begetting those who teach because it prefers those who rule? We may never know, but the ink remains, and where ink remains, so too does a whisper. The church has always kept records, yet some of the most influential voices in its long memory are the ones left off the parchment. A page torn out before the ink ever dried. Calia, the girl who taught a pope to read between the lines, became one of those voices, not erased, not punished, simply excluded. And so her story, what little of it survives, must be pieced together not from grand declarations or PayPal bulls, but from quieter clues, fragments, a copied phrase here, an unusual script there, places where her influence lingered, like a scent on old paper. It's in those quiet places that we find her, again, not as a girl, but as a method, a way of writing, reading, thinking that persisted even when her name did not. After Kalia was pulled from her father's work, her days became uneventful. She rose early, helped with house chores, ground herbs. She was not sent to a convent, though that was the usual path. Her father, perhaps out of guilt or stubborn love, kept her home and quietly gave her scraps of used parchment to recycle. She wrote in margins, in palimpsests, on the backs of grocery alleys and torn prayer traps. By necessity, her work became non-linear fragments stitched together between duties. A list of Latin verbs beside a recipe for cheese. A speculative calendar scribbled around the borders of a hymn. This style, fragmented, fluid, adaptive, would later be misinterpreted by scholars as evidence of amateur scribes or untrained hands. But they weren't errors. They were survivals. Kalia had learned early on that a woman's ideas could only travel under disguise, so she didn't argue. She just adapted. Meanwhile, the boy she once taught Gregorios was no longer a boy. By his 20s, he had begun his clerical ascent, first as a subdeacon, then as a deacon, eventually as a trusted advisor in the Lateran bureaucracy. His letters from this period, which survive in moderate numbers, reveal a mind unusually preoccupied with consistency in scripture and clarity in doctrine. He often chastised fellow clergy for ambiguous phrasing, poor Latin, or faulty logic. In one note, addressed to a fellow deacon, he wrote, "A poorly copied psalm is not merely an error, it is a falsehood in God's tongue." This focus on textual exactness, almost obsessive, was rare in his time, and it bore striking resemblance to the lessons Kalia once taught him in secret. Never trust a sentence that cannot be explained twice. Every scripture is two things, a mirror and a mask. God may be infallible, scribes are not. He never quoted her directly, but the fingerprints were there, hidden into precision in Ravenna. Kalia's days stretched into years. Her father grew frail. His fingers, once steady and confident, trembled now. He copied more slowly, took fewer commissions. Kalia, quietly, took over some of his work, unofficially, of course. Her hand imitated his so well that few noticed the shift. She never signed her name, but her style clipped ascenders. Firm capitals, rare ligatures began to show up in city records, court briefs, and even liturgical glosses. The Vatican registry from this period shows an unusual uptick in calligraphic variation in Ravenna's outgoing documents, a fact later attributed to an unknown hand. That hand was likely hers, and though she knew she could never be publicly acknowledged, she persisted, because in her world, writing was not about recognition, it was about continuity. But then, something odd happened. A bishop from Benevento visited Ravenna in 709. He was in search of a skilled scribe who could produce bilingual glosses for a disputed theological treatise, one that needed careful rendering in both Greek and Latin. Callia's father was too weak to accept, but the bishop, having heard quiet rumors, requested to meet the daughter with the sharp ink. Callia was summoned, and for the first time in years, he was asked to copy, officially, not as an assistant, not as a hidden hand, but as a scribe, still not under her name. But this time, she was allowed to write freely. Her Greek was excellent, rhythmic, unornamented. She used subtle spacing to distinguish theological terms that often muddled together in translation. The bishop was impressed. He sent the treatise to Rome. That's where things get interesting. In the Vatican archives, there's a document titled Contra Trinitas et Pro Unitate, a rather technical theological commentary on the nature of the Trinity. Most copies from that time use standard clerical phrasing, but one version, attributed only to a Ravenna scribe, contains unusually elegant transitions with metaphors involving water, ink, and flame. It also features a footnote comparing divine mystery to the unreadable spaces in torn manuscripts. No male cleric of the time wrote like that. Some modern historians believe that version was Callia's, but the church has never confirmed it. They rarely confirm ghosts. By 715, Gregory II became pope. Caelia was 30 by then, still unmarried, still writing in margins. She may have heard of his election from the bells, or from a passing messenger, or perhaps her father, then close to death, told her. There's no record of her reaction, but it's tempting to imagine her pausing, just for a moment, over a line of text, the ink still drying, thinking of the boy who once questioned the contradictions in Genesis with such fervor. Would he remember her? Would he mention her? He did not, at least, not by name. But in his first decree as pope, he demanded increased funding for clerical schools in Ravenna, with particular attention to scribal training in both tongues. Some say it was coincidence, others, kindness, still others, guilt. Whatever the reason, the funds arrived, but they were used to train boys. Girls remained at the edges, where Callia always had been. The final recorded mention of Callia comes from an inventory list in the archives of San Vitale, the great octagonal basilica of Ravenna. Among the items recorded in 721, a chest of vellum scraps, key, Greek Latin, glossary, and 6 folios of unknown hand, gifted by Lucius's daughter, who no longer copies. No mention of illness. Number. Mention of death. Just an acknowledgement that she had stopped, perhaps from fatigue or vision loss, or a world that no longer needed her. Perhaps because the boy she once taught had reached the highest seat in Christendom, and still, the sky did not open. Still, her name remained forgotten. Still, the silence held. But was it really silence? Or something else? A whisper, a nudge, a presence, a method. Today, medievalists study marginalia, the tiny notes scribbled beside scripture. They often find recurring themes, quiet critiques, alternative readings, grammatical corrections, questions phrased as prayers. Some call these anonymous scribes interlinear spirits. But what if some of them were just women like Callia, not saints, not rebels, not martyrs, just writers, survivors, people who passed knowledge without needing credit, the kind of people who taught popes how to read, and then let them go. Long after the great scribes are gone, after the churches crumble, and the gold leaf flakes from the margins of ancient books, Something quieter remains, not the names, not the seals, but the script itself, the shape of the letters, the rhythm of the punctuation, the choices behind what was copied, okay, and what was not. In the final decades of the 8th century, scribes working in distant monasteries sometimes paused over curious annotations in old treatises from Ravenna. They puzzled over the unusually clear grammar, the fluid phrasing, the almost poetic transitions in otherwise dry theological texts. They noted how certain words, particularly those tied to questions of doubt or complexity, were underlined with a soft, steady stroke, not embellished, not scolded, just gently illuminated. No one wrote like that anymore, and no one, it seemed, ever claimed authorship. But the style did not disappear. It re-emerged in unexpected places, in the teaching manuals of Carolingian schools, in the scholia of Irish monks who had somehow come across Italian glossaries, and even in the way future popes referenced their own doubts, not as weaknesses, but as starting points for learning. This was Kelly's true legacy, not the pages she touched, but the mind she quietly shaped. We cannot say with certainty what happened to her. There are no funeral records, no inscriptions, no relics claimed in her name. It's only one final thread, a brittle parchment tucked inside the bindings of a forgotten psalter, now stored in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan. The psalter, once thought mundane, was digitized in 2011. A small team of paleographers cataloging the inner spine found a reused slip of parchment pasted under the back cover. It was a practice sheet, standard for the time, reused to reinforce bindings. On it were two simple lines: the eye sees only what the hand dares to copy, but the hand copies only what the heart is allowed to know. The script was elegant, precise, slightly slanted to the left, unusual, and next to it, in the tiniest of Latin abbreviations, a note from Kalia, in the quiet year. We don't know what she meant by the quiet year. Some scholars speculate it refers to a period of illness or personal retreat. Others believe it was the year her father died, the year she stopped writing formally. But what matters more is that she wrote it at all. A private moment, a gift not meant to be found, and yet it was in 732. Pope Gregory II died. His papacy is remembered for many things: resisting imperial influence, supporting missionary activity, strengthening the Roman Church's independence from Constantinople. But what is often overlooked is his obsessive commitment to clarity in church texts. He once declared, "The gospel must be read as if the breath of God still rests between each word." Teak, a poetic statement, and one that echoes the phrasing of someone he once knew, someone who, decades earlier, had traced his finger across the pages of Genesis and asked him if he could spot the contradictions, if he could hear the rhythm of meaning, not just the sound of doctrine. That someone, of course, was Caelia, and though he never named her publicly, there's reason to believe he remembered her. In his final will, preserved in partial fragments, Gregory directed that a portion of his library be sent to the scriptorium in Ravenna for the instruction of those who teach without reward. A curious phrase: teach without reward, teach without credit, teach without name, teach as she had. Let's step back now. Let's imagine her one last time. Older now, gray perhaps, stooped slightly from years bent over cramped desks and poor lighting, her fingers ink-stained, her back sore. She's sitting in the corner of a modest room, sorting used parchment by softness, muttering softly in Latin as she decides which words are worth preserving and which must be wiped and overwritten. A novice asks her what to do. With a leaf of scripture damaged by wax, she answers not with instructions, but with a story about a copyist in Antioch who once filled in a missing verse, not by guessing, but by silence, leaving the line blank so the reader would notice the gap. Sometimes Guess the gap teaches more than the word. The novice nods, unsure. But years later, that same novice writes a treatise on textual integrity, arguing that scribes must note their own uncertainties in the margins, rather than pretending all text is complete. The influence spreads, not as a name, but as a habit, a whisper in the ink. By the 9th century, the women were largely excluded from formal education again. Stories of early female scribes were treated more like legends than fact. A scholar named Alcuin, writing to Charlemagne, mentioned those quiet hands in Italy who once brought light to tangled thoughts. No names were given, just admiration, and maybe that was fitting, because Kalia's legacy was never about fame. It was about clarity, precision, tact, curiosity, the boring parts of history, grammar, syntax, margin space, parchment, softness, all the things no one builds statues for, but those boring things shape everything else. They are the spine of civilization, and she, in her quiet room, with her quiet ink, helped strengthen that spine. So, why was her name forgotten? Why did no one write about the girl who taught a pope to read? The answer, perhaps, is both simple and cruel, because she was not meant to be remembered, because memory, like authorship, was a privilege tied to position, to gender, to power, to ordination. She never had those things. She had only her ink, but she used it, and in doing so, she changed the shape of thought ever so slightly for centuries. Tonight, as you lie there, eyes growing heavier, try to picture her not as a myth or a mystery, but as a person, a girl in a stone room, scratching lines into old parchment. Oh, woman surrounded by silence, a teacher whose greatest lesson was never spoken aloud, a whisper in a church full of echoes. There is a stretch of cobbled road in Rome where the papal processions once passed in silence, between the ancient Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano and the Vatican. The long ceremonial path winds through the very bones of the city under aqueduct shadows, past the leaning columns of forgotten temples, and across the foundations of pagan courts once paved over by Christian triumph. And at one narrow corner, tradition says the procession would pause, not to pray, not to chant, but to test a chair. It was called the sedia statuaria, a strange marble seat with a large oval hole in the middle, like a crude toilet. A man would sit, a cleric would reach underneath, and then a quiet confirmation would be made. Ver est. He is a man. Only then could the new pope continue. Why this ceremony existed, and why it was held for centuries, remains a curious, uncomfortable question. The church never gave a straight answer, but many say it began because once, just once, the voice that came from the throne of St. Peter did not belong to a man. The story of Pope Joan is not a comfortable one, even now. It lives in the margins, whispered in apocryphal texts, hinted at in medieval chronicles, laughed off by modern scholars as a legend, and yet stubbornly persistent, like a thorn in the page of church history. It cannot be fully removed. The first known mention appears in the 13th century, written by a Dominican friar named Jean de Mailly, who included a brief entry in his Chronicle of Popes. According to him, a woman disguised as a man had risen through the clerical ranks and had been elected pope, only to give birth publicly and disastrously during a papal procession through Rome. She died shortly after, either from the birth itself or at the hands of a mob. Her name is never stated in the earliest versions, only her mistake. You might wonder, how could such a thing happen? How could a woman ascend to the highest office of the Catholic Church, wearing robes meant for men, speaking with authority forbidden to her, and sitting in the very seat believed to hold the keys of St. Peter? To answer that, you must first forget what you think you know about medieval Rome. It was not the towering marble city of legend. It was a city of ruins, broken columns, roofless churches, rats in the Forum. The Tiber, overflowed regularly, flooding the streets with filth. The Lateran Palace, once the residence of popes, was half crumbling in parts. Literacy was rare. Communications were slow. Bishops and nobles bribed one another in dim corners, and papal elections were often decided not by merit, but by manipulation. In short, it was a world full of gaps. And in those gaps, strange things sometimes grew. One version of the tale claims she was English. Another says she was German. Still another insists she was from Athens, raised in disguise by a Greek tutor after her father died in battle. In every telling, though, she is clever, brilliant with languages, quick with scripture, talented with the quill. Her early years are spent in monasteries, posing as a boy. She excels beyond all others, and in time is ordained. She takes the name Johannes Anglicus, John, the Englishman, and from there the story diverges wildly. Some say she became a curial official in Rome. Others claim she was a private tutor to a cardinal. But all paths lead to the same place, a papal conclave disrupted by infighting, sudden vacancy, and a surprise election. She is chosen, they say, not because of her name, but because of her neutrality. No faction expected her to last long. They were wrong. For 2 years, or perhaps 3, the woman called Pope John reigned. She wrote decrees, signed letters, arbitrated theological disputes. Her tone was clear, measured, and unusually tolerant of scholarly dissent, a trait some chroniclers note with surprise. There are no surviving papal bulls with her name, no coins struck with her image. But this, too, is part of the mystery. If she never existed, why do multiple 13th and 14th century sources insist she did? Martin of Opava, a 13th century papal historian, writes of her in his Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum. He even gives a location for the fatal moment, a narrow lane between the Colosseum and St. Clement's Basilica, where, during a procession, she gave birth and was stoned to death by the crowd. Later, chroniclers place a stone marker on the street, Pater, Patrum, Papus, Perdito, Partem Peter, Father of Fathers. Betray the birth of the woman pope. The marker is long gone, but the legend stayed. Not everyone believed it. Of course, proponents of papal infallibility dismissed the story as slander. After the Reformation, Protestant writers clung to the tale with relish, using it to ridicule Catholic claims of divine appointment. The Church, in turn, claimed the story was fabricated entirely by anti-clerical factions in the later Middle Ages, a moral fable rather than history. Modern historians remain divided. There is no conclusive evidence she existed, but there is no conclusive evidence she didn't. And perhaps the very structure of the story, a woman hiding in plain sight, punished for knowledge, erased from the records, is itself the kind of truth that does not need verification to carry weight. Because whether she lived or not, she's remembered, and that remembrance points to something larger, a long-standing fear of women in power, a fear so deep it required rituals like the Sedius Stercoraria, marble tests for masculinity, to keep the ghost of her memory at bay. But let's pause for a moment. Let's ask something simpler. What would it have taken? What precise historical conditions could have allowed for such a thing? A female pope, elected, reigning, and forgotten? The answer lies not in conspiracy, but in bureaucracy. For much of the early Middle Ages, the papacy was not as centralized. Office records were kept sporadically. Successions were often contested. Decays of several months or even years between popes were common. There are multiple instances in church history where 2 rival claimants each declared themselves pope, the so-called anti-popes. And during times of plague, war, or famine, many officials fled Rome altogether, leaving power vacuums behind. In one such gap, say, between 853 and 855, a particularly clever individual, fluent in Latin, with connections to the Roman clergy and a carefully managed identity, might have risen unnoticed. especially if she made no enemies, especially if she posed no threat, especially if she pretended, in every possible way, to be the quietest of leaders until the moment her body betrayed her and history, caught off guard, erased her instead of naming her. Later, Catholic apologists would argue that no such pope ever existed because she is not found in official Vatican records. But that reasoning is circular. If the church erased her, of course she wouldn't be in the records. And if they didn't, why did they change the route of papal processions in the 10th century, explicitly avoiding the spot where she was said to have died? Why, for centuries, was no pope allowed to use the name John VIII, the supposed number assigned to her reign, until well after the story faded? Why was there a sudden emphasis on visibly verifying papal masculinity, not just in clothing, but in presence? Why was the marble throne used at all? Even if the story isn't true, it shaped real policy. Even if she never lived, the church acted as if she had. So, what was her name? Was it Agnes, Theodora, Joan? Or did she never need one? Was her erasure the point? A cautionary tale made flesh, myth formed from fragments of frustration. All the women who copied texts but never signed them, who taught Latin but could not preach, who corrected scripture in the margins but could not read it aloud. Maybe Pope Joan, real or not, is not one person, but many. All those silenced lives concentrated into a single story the church could not quite scrub away. It is late now, and the procession has passed. The marble chair is empty. The road is quiet, but the silence still whispers. Who was she? Why was she erased? And if she had not been, would anything have changed? Let's walk back a bit, not down the quiet streets of medieval Rome, but through the parchment itself, through the manuscripts, the library ledgers, the illuminated margins. Let us imagine a place most visitors to the Middle Ages never looked: the scriptorium, the quiet, candlelit chamber where monks bent over vellum with ink-stained fingers, copying line after line of holy text, imperial letters, medical treatises, and, now and then, chronicles. This is where history was recorded, not as an absolute truth, but as memory shaped by belief. And this is where Pope Joan, if she existed at all, was quietly reinterpreted, not by denying her, but by simply not writing her. The medieval church controlled not only what was taught, but also what was remembered. Its libraries were repositories of power, not unlike today's servers and databases. The copying of documents was a sacred task, but it was also, very often, a political one. It's important to remember that papal records during the early Middle Ages were inconsistent at best. The Liber Pontifices, a running account of papal biographies begun in the 6th century, was updated sporadically. Gaps of 5 or 10 years appear. Some popes have long biographies, others have only a few lines. Names shift, dates are debated. Political motives, especially during periods of schism or imperial pressure, clearly shaped what was emphasized or omitted. And in this landscape of convenient silence, it would have been easy to remove one entry, especially if the scandal was great, especially if the shame was generational. But erasure is never clean. Even when the church tried to suppress the story, echoes remained. Travelers passing through Rome repeated strange rumors. Northern monks scribbled passing mentions in their marginal notes. By the 1200s, the story reappeared not just in isolated chronicles, but in sermons. Martin of Opava's account, the most complete early telling, was widely circulated. It appeared in popular compendia, including the Golden Legend, a sort of medieval bestseller that combined saints' lives with moral fables. In these versions, Pope Joan was not a villain, nor was she exactly a hero. She was a warning, a moral lesson wrapped in historical possibility. A woman too curious, too brilliant, too bold, and therefore doomed. Now, let's look at the other evidence, not of her life, God, but of the church's strange behavior in the centuries following the legend's rise. For example, the sedia stercoraria, the marble chair with the hole beneath it. Modern historians disagree about its origin. Some claim it was a Roman birthing chair or a reused toilet from antiquity, repurposed as a symbol of humility. Others suggest it was part of an elaborate coronation ritual, meant to confirm the physical integrity and, by implication, masculinity of the Pope. At least 2 of these chairs exist today, held in the Vatican museums and in a later day, are elaborately carved, made of red porphyry, a rare stone used only for emperors, and they bear witness to a strange, undignified ritual that was quietly discontinued by the 16th century. Was it really about verifying gender? Or was it a theatrical act meant to bury a rumor by reenacting its opposite over and over again? If so, it worked for a while. Another curiosity. A statue once stood along the papal route through Rome. It marked the spot where Pope John was said to have died. The statue no longer exists, but it was mentioned in guidebooks from the 15th century. It was called La Papessa, the Papacies, and even though the Vatican denied this story, it never officially removed the statue. Eventually, it simply vanished. Scholars think it may have been destroyed during urban renovations or quietly taken down by church officials eager to erase any remaining embarrassment. Yet, in certain calendars from the Renaissance period, the name Johanna appears not as a pope, but as a strange footnote, or whisper in the chronology. You could read right past it, and not notice. But she was there, still hidden, still being doubted. Let's step further back. Let's ask, not if Joan existed, but why her legend existed. Because legends, even when untrue, point toward something real. In this case, the medieval obsession with disguise, with hidden women in male spaces, with subversion of gendered roles, with the danger of curiosity. And education in women was not new. Consider the legends of Saint Marina or Saint Pelagia, women who dressed as monks, entered monasteries, and lived their lives in secret. Their stories often ended in revelation, shame, or sainthood, depending on the tone. The idea of a woman fooling men, especially within the church, was both terrifying and fascinating to medieval audiences. Pope Joan's story tapped into these same cultural anxieties. She wasn't just a rogue woman. She was a clever one, an intellectual, someone who used the tools of men, language, learning, logic, to climb too high. And so, the story punished her with childbirth, public exposure, death, and then a memory smeared into myth. But not everyone forgot her. During the Reformation, Protestant polemicists revived the tale with vigor. Writers like David Blondel used her as a weapon against papal authority. Look, they said, even the papacy is corrupt. It let a woman reign and then tried to cover it up. This embarrassed the Catholic Church, which responded by discrediting the story through scholarship by the 17th century. The Jesuit historian Jean Hardouin declared the tale a fable invented by anti-papal satirists, exaggerated by poor record-keeping, and inflated by popular imagination. Modern scholars, too, remain divided. Some see the story as pure legend, the medieval equivalent of gossip. Others point to the strange silences in the papal court between Leo IV, died 855, and Benedict III, elected later that year, where a small gap exists, unexplained by official texts. Could that have been her reign? Just 2 years? Long enough to issue orders, hold councils, sign documents, and yet short enough to scrub away once the scandal broke. Here's another mystery in the tarot deck, specifically the Tarot of Marseille from the 15th century. There is a card called La Papesse, the Papesses. It depicts a woman dressed in papal robes, holding a book. She is calm, regal, silent. Some say this is Pope Joan. It's preserved in symbol. Others argue the card reflects a mystical figure, a feminine counterpart to religious power, perhaps even the Virgin Mary cast in ecclesiastical form. But in a world where popes were male and church power was absolute, the very idea of a papstess was subversive. And yet, she remained. Decks across Europe, shuffled, drawn, read. Her presence, a quiet defiance, a historical maybe that would not die. So, how do we process all this? How do we sleep beside a story that never fully happened and yet never fully went away? Maybe we began by asking, what if she did exist? What would her daily life have looked like? Would she have sat by candlelight, reading Augustine and Ambrose? Would she have penned letters to faraway bishops, careful not to give herself away? Would she have prayed each night for the strength to keep the disguise? Or did she walk boldly, believing, as many do now, that gender should not limit wisdom? That truth, if spoken softly enough, still carries weight. Her story lives not because it is certain, but because it is needed. Because somewhere between the forgotten margins of medieval history and the carved rituals of stone, we understand something else. That power, when threatened, will silence, not by force alone, but by omission. And sometimes, the most dangerous truth is the one simply left unwritten. She may never have held the keys of St. Peter. She may never have signed a PayPal bull, but her shadow was felt in marble, in memory, in the need to confirm, over and over, that the man on the throne was truly a man. So we end again at the procession, where the popes pass silently down the Roman road, and where, for centuries, the people watched a strange pause at the chair, a ritual born not of faith, but of fear. Fear of memory, fear of possibility, fear of a truth too embarrassing to admit, and too powerful to fully erase. We begin again on the old cobbled roads of medieval Rome. The sun is low. Shadows stretch like worn banners across the stones. Procession is approaching, but slower this time. The ceremonial steps of a newly elected pope echo softly in the morning air, heavy with incense and the weight of centuries. And just ahead, as tradition demands, the chair awaits. The sedius stercoraria, that strange hollow seat of polished porphyry, a stone once used only for emperors, now positioned for a strange, unspoken inspection. He will sit upon it, briefly, solemnly, and a designated cardinal, often the chamberlain, will quietly confirm what everyone pretends not to question, that the new pope is, in fact, man. This ritual is not written into any official PayPal document. It exists on the margins, like a smudge that never washes out of history. The ritual's purpose has long been debated. Some claimed it was a metaphor, a humbling gesture before the throne of St. Peter, echoing the Latin phrase extercor dies exaltavit humilium, from dung, God raises the humble. Others said it was proof of gender, of anatomy, of something that could no longer be trusted after the scandal. Even when no one named her, everyone seemed to remember her. Even in her absence, she had become a fixture. That's the quiet power of rumor. In a world built on records, it slips in through silence. By the 16th century, the church had done what it does best when confronted by uncomfortable legends. It began to codify denial. Historians and theologians were commissioned to correct the record. Chronologies were tightened. Gaps were explained away. The PayPal catalog, once full of discrepancies and awkward ellipses, began to take on a smoother shape. But even as scholars wrote her out, artists painted her in manuscripts, in cards, in whispered stories told to pilgrims over shared bread and watered wine. They said she had a name, Johanna, or Agnes, or Gilberta. They said she studied in Athens, or in Mainz, or in Rome itself. They said she wore the PayPal tiara not once, but many times, until the day she gave birth on the street. And they said she died there, crushed, not just by the mob, but by the shame of exposure. No official church record mentions this, but here's what does exist. A century-long debate among medieval scholars about a mysterious 2-year vacancy in the papal line, a 13th century street statue, later removed, labeled the Papes. A string of liturgical practices inexplicably focused on physical confirmation of papal identity. Tarot cards from the 1400s depicting a woman in papal robes holding a book with the title La Paps. Protestant writers in the Reformation era weaponizing the story to discredit Rome. Vatican silence. Stretched over centuries, broken only by occasional denials, and, in between all of these facts, the hum of discomfort, that nervous energy history produces when a story cannot quite be killed. The legacy of Pope Joan, or the Papes, lies at the border of fact and fable. She has no official tomb, no papal bulls carry her seal, and yet she refuses to disappear. Even modern historians, with access to Vatican archives and carbon-dated parchments, struggle to form consensus. Was she real? A literary device? Distorted memory of some other scandal? Or an amalgamation, fragments of truth stitched into a cloak of myth? One compelling theory suggests the tale of Pope Joan emerged as a satire, a moralistic story woven to criticize the Church's corruption, particularly in the 10th century, a time known as the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy. This period was rife with power struggles, bribes, illegitimate successions, foreign influence. Perhaps the legend of a female pope was less about gender and more about chaos. Oh, way to personify the absurdity of a church that had lost its way. But satire, like fire, cannot always be contained. The image of a woman, cunning, educated, mistaken for a man sitting on the throne of Peter, was too potent, too haunting, too possible. And so, it grew roots. It leached into sermons. It bloomed in manuscripts. And, eventually, it demanded an answer, one the Church never gave. Let us pause for a moment here and imagine, instead, her life not as scandal, but as daily routine. Picture her rising early, before the bells, before the scribes stir, before the monks begin their chants. She walks the stone corridors of the Lateran Palace with soft sandals, robes singed, thoughts already racing. She is reading, always reading, letters from the East, petitions from villages, reports of bishops overstepping their bounds. She meets with envoys under candlelight. She dictates responses in careful Latin. She blesses pilgrims in hushed rooms. Her knowledge is respected, her decisions admired, but behind every gaze, a threat. Behind every oath, a question. How long can she keep the secret? And does she believe it is a sin to have been born a woman? Or a sin to have lied? In this imagined routine lies the quiet heart of the legend. The contradiction between what the Church demanded, virtue, knowledge, order, and who it allowed to embody those traits. And it did not allow women, not in learning, not in power, not in robes cut for popes. But Joan's story, whether true or not, refuses to be buried by doctrine. In every age where the role of women in religion is questioned, her name returns. She becomes a mirror held up to patriarchy. Ghost walking beside the bishop's dot in the 20th century. Feminist scholars reclaimed her as a symbol, not of rebellion, but of erasure. She was not burned. She was not anathematized. She was deleted. And, in that, she shares the fate of many women in history, not punished visibly, but simply forgotten. And yet, still, she appears in novels, in essays, in whispered jokes among scholars, in the silent pause of coronation rituals. Long since abandoned, but never fully explained. Even the Vatican's strongest denial, issued centuries after the legend was born, cannot quite erase her, because she is not just a person. She is a possibility, and possibilities cannot be unlearned. What if she did exist? And what if her final moment, giving birth on the street, amidst a stunned crowd, was not her fall, but her release? Not a failure, but a transformation. Maybe the story survived, not because it condemned her, but because it vindicated her in its own strange, tragic way. The throne she sat on may have had no name. The records may have been cleansed, but memory, flawed, stubborn, and curious, held on. And now, centuries later, she is remembered, not in marble, but in myth, not in canon, but in curiosity. So, the question remains, not whether she lived, but why we keep asking if she did. Why does the mind reach for her in quiet hours? Why do artists still draw her? Why do researchers still peer into ancient gaps, hoping to catch a glimpse? 'Cause some silences are too loud to ignore, and some erasures, once noticed, become the clearest form of truth. Somewhere in the back corridors of a dusty Benedictine abbey in northern France, under the slanting sun of a particularly mild 12th century spring, there was a nun who walked differently than the others. Not faster, not with more authority. That would have drawn attention. She walked as if she were always measuring, as if the stone beneath her sandals mattered, as if the path she took every morning from the dormitory to the scriptorium held some secret geometry. Only she understood. Her name was Sister Beatrice of Morienville. Okay, and if you had visited the Abbey of St. Pyrrhus Dives in the year 1124, you would not have known her name. She did not sing the loudest during matins. She did not tend the herb gardens. She did not even have her own cell. But if you were to open any of the Latin manuscripts copied in that abbey between 1112 and 1130, and look carefully, not at the text, but at the small, marginal notes, the interlinear glosses, the corrections that appear in a hand sharper and slightly more leftward leaning than the rest, you might find her. Single letter added to correct a theological misquote, a subtle note in tiny script, ambigua verba, translate carefully, and then, can one copy of Jerome's commentary on Isaiah, 3 words in pale ink, nearly faded to dust. Verbum carnis est. The word is flesh. She wrote it beside a heavily edited passage, one the abbot had insisted be removed from public view to understand Beatrice's quiet rebellion. You have to understand what it meant to translate the word in the 12th century. The Bible was still not for the people. Its original languages, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, were studied only by a handful of male scholars with permission from Rome. Latin was the sacred tongue of the Vulgate, and even that was meant to be heard, not read, and certainly not interpreted. Translation was dangerous. Even comparing 2 Latin versions of the same verse could spark accusations of heresy. But Beatrice was not translating in the open dot. She was doing something slower, something quieter. She was tracing the fault lines in the Latin itself, watching how meaning bent, how it cracked, how it softened when carried into prayer by women who did not understand the syntax, only the shape of the devotion. She would sit in the scriptorium, eyes low, copying page after page of accepted texts, sermons, saints' lives, PayPal bulls. But in the margins, she wrote questions, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a hybridized Old French. Why does the man speak for the angel? If Mary is called blessed among women, what is her word? Tongue of Eve-born knowledge. Does that not make it holy? No one ever saw her write them. No one, perhaps, ever meant that Beatrice was not a theologian by title. But she had learned from one when she was a girl, barely 12. She was sent to the monastery, not by her parents, but by a clerk of the cathedral, her uncle, who served under a bishop with unorthodox tastes in scholarship. He had once imported commentaries from Byzantium. He had allowed Jewish philosophers to debate with Christian students in public courtyards, and he had a habit of sending gifted girls, those who showed unusual ability in reading and composition, to the care of monastic libraries, under the condition that they remained silent about their studies. Beatrice was one of those girls. She learned her first Latin prayers by echo. She learned grammar from listening to corrections shouted across the scriptorium. But she learned meaning, true, deliberate, quiet meaning from reading the margins. Old books at St. Pierre d'Eves had been copied and recopied for decades. Some had been annotated by monks who long since died. A few had notes from visitors, scribes passing through on pilgrimage, and in these margins, Beatrice discovered a pattern, that the men who copied the texts feared deviation, but that they could not stop themselves from doubting. They left notes like, unclear, check other copy, too harsh, soften. In these doubts, Beatrice found a kind of companionship, and in them, she saw space opening up, not to destroy the word, but to understand it. Her most daring act was not a translation. It was a concordance. She began compiling in secret a table of recurring phrases in the Vulgate, cross-referencing them by theme, not by chronology. She wanted to know how the same word was used in different contexts, how caritas, loved, changed when applied to God versus when applied to women, how verbum word was treated when it was Christ, and when it was married, how silentium, silence, shifted from being a punishment to a virtue, depending on who held it. She never finished the table, but portions of it were found in 1892, tucked behind a false spine in the binding of a psalter. They were not signed, but the handwriting was hers. The soft slant, the minimal ligatures, the precise spacing. She had not translated the Bible. She had taught it to breathe differently. There is no record of her death, only a brief note in the Abbey's 1134 inventory item. 1 novice nun departed, no possessions, but in a 12th century manuscript now housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, shelf mark, Latin 3461. There's a curious note. The page is here amended in red. These were not done by our brother scribe. They carry the hand of one who listens, and next to it, the symbol of a tiny ear drawn in the corner, as if the text itself had been overheard. Some say that was Beatrice S. Mark, not a name, just an ear. She had once written, "The word is flesh," but she never claimed which word, or whose flesh. She simply pointed gently in the margins, where women have always left their mark, out of reach of fire and ink and authority. The word marginalia comes from the Latin margo, the edge, the border, space where something is allowed to spill over, where it's kept just outside the core, where it has been marked, not by what is important, but by what can't be fully contained. If you were to trace the marginal notes of any medieval manuscript, you'd find that most of the corrections, amendments, or additions were small. A single word added here, a phrase rewritten there. No full paragraphs, no chapters. It's just a comment here and there, tucked between the lines. It's creating a secondary history, one that is often overlooked. But in these hidden edges, lives were lived, minds were shaped, and knowledge was exchanged in secret. This was where Sister Beatrice found her voice, where she could write freely, where her ink-stained fingers could push back against the limits of her silence. It was not in the formal liturgies. It was not in the prayers sung during Vespers or Matins. It was not in the sermons preached by the monks from their pulpit. Her voice was found in the quiet spaces, the footnotes, the corrections, suggested amendments to the text, where she could question, interpret, and challenge the words without facing reprisal. When Beatrice first arrived at the Abbey of St. Pierre d'Eves, she was assigned to the scriptorium, not because of any special skill, but because of her ability to follow instruction. The Abbey, like most monastic orders, required the transcription of sacred texts for use in the local communities and for export to other regions. The scriptorium was a quiet space where novice monks and nuns copied the texts of saints, scriptures, and prayers over and over again. The task was menial, repetitive, but it was sacred work, and Beatrice quickly learned that silence was the rule. To disturb the work of the Abbey was to disturb the sacred task of preserving God's word. But Beatrice had always been different. She was a girl of few words, but sharp observations. She understood the discipline of the task, but she also saw what was missing, the nuance, the hidden meanings, things that the copyists often overlooked or took for granted. For example, she copied a passage from Jerome's Vulgate translation of the Bible. She noticed something that many of the other scribes missed, a seemingly insignificant preposition in a passage about the incarnation of Christ. Verbum caro factum est. The word became flesh, had been altered. Okay. The Latin preposition factum made was used, but it had been mistranslated or misinterpreted in earlier texts. Instead of copying the text word for word, Beatrice paused. She knew the implications of this tiny difference. Was the word made by flesh, or was it made into flesh? In the silence of her work, she wrote in the margin of the text, verbum carnis est, the word is flesh. It was a subtle change, a correction, but a radical one. By inserting this correction, Beatrice had not only challenged the language of the text, but also the theology of the Vulgate. She had taken it one step further. She had moved beyond the accepted doctrine and into a realm of questioning. She had made a theological assertion in the margins. The note was carefully hidden. Few would have noticed it. Most readers, focused on the text itself, would never have given the marginal correction a second thought. But to Beatrice, it was a quiet defiance, a theological puzzle presented not with loud proclamation, but with whispered ink. There were many other notes, not as direct or as provocative, but still significant. In one manuscript of the Confessions by St. Augustine, Beatrice wrote, "Nan possumus intelligere quid viret cum homo sit tantum." We cannot understand what it is when the man is only. The translation was ambiguous. Augustine had written of the human condition and the struggle to understand divine grace. But Beatrice's insertion hinted at a deeper theological interpretation. The struggle, not just between man and God, between the roles assigned to men and women in theological discourse. She had placed the words in a space between two long passages, a hidden line of questioning beneath Augustine's larger thoughts on sin and redemption. For Beatrice, these small, secretive annotations were the beginning of a dialogue. She was not just copying text, she was engaging with it, wrestling with it. She was not adding to the established doctrine. She was reshaping it in ways that others could not easily see. But she knew the danger of what she was doing. Marginalia were not meant to carry weight in the way the main text did. To speak in the margins was to speak without authority. To claim the margins as a space for interpretation was to risk the wrath of those who held power over the sacred text. Yet, Beatrice's additions were subtle enough to remain unnoticed. In a sense, they existed in a space both safe and dangerous. They were hidden, but not without purpose. It is important to note that Beatrice's work was not an isolated instance. Throughout the medieval period, there were many women who worked in scriptoriums, copying texts, preserving knowledge, and occasionally inserting their thoughts into the margins. Their contributions were often overlooked or dismissed, but they played an essential role in the transmission of knowledge, particularly in times of political or social upheaval, when the transmission of knowledge was most threatened. In abbeys and convents across Europe, women like Beatrice quietly shaped the theological landscape. They were the unseen hands that maintained the written word, and though their work often went unrecognized, it was no less important than the works of the men whose names appeared in the annals of history. Beatrice's marginalia, though small and seemingly insignificant, were a testament to the power of women's voices in medieval scholarship. In a world where women were largely excluded from formal positions of authority, they found ways to participate in the intellectual and spiritual life of their communities. They engaged in conversation with the texts, shaping interpretations, and passing on ideas that would echo down the centuries. One of the most fascinating aspects of Beatrice's life was her quiet ability to manipulate language itself. Her mastery of Latin, combined with her fluency in Old French, gave her an understanding of the texts that many of her male counterparts lacked. She understood not just the surface meaning of the words, but the deep structures of language. How words could be used to obscure or clarify, to challenge or to conform. In one instance, Beatrice copied a portion of the De Civitate by St. Augustine, a long and complex treatise on the city of God. As she copied, she added a note in the margin: in quo genera civitatis homines sunt immutabiles et ideo spiritualia omnia sunt. In this kind of city, people are unchangeable, okay? And therefore, all things spiritual are. This note, though written in small script, was a commentary on Augustine's larger work. Beatrice was not only reiterating Augustine's ideas, she was questioning them. What did it mean for a city, a community, to be unchangeable? Was such rigidity a sign of divine order, or the fatal flaw of earthly kingdoms? And in the small space of the margin, Beatrice was asserting her right to ask the question in her later years. As Beatrice became more established within the abbey, her annotations began to take on a different tone. No longer were they just small corrections. No longer were they quiet questions in the margins. They became full-fledged ideas in a manuscript of the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. Beatrice wrote a long passage: Fides non est solum veritas universalis, sed etiam fides hominum quabacat in corde tu, etsm per vies non explicitus, per dolorum et conatus. Faith is not just the universal truth, but also the faith of the people, which calls to your heart. Even through paths that are not explicit, through pain and struggle. In this note, Beatrice did not just reference Aquinas' theological position. She subtly redirected it, placing the experience of faith not in abstract theology, but in the lived experience of the people, of women, of those on the margins, of those who had no voice. The subversive power of her annotation lies not in its content, but in its location. She had inserted this note in a critical moment of Aquinas' argument, challenging the very assumptions of theology that place women as passive recipients of divine grace. As the years passed, Beatrice's work in the scriptorium became well known. Her translations were not celebrated. They were ignored. Her ideas, too, remained in the margins. But the margins are where history is often born, in the places left out of the records, in the forgotten cracks between the pages. Though she was never recognized, her voice endured. In the small, hidden corners of the texts, her questions remained. And as long as those texts were copied, those questions were passed on. In this, Beatrice's legacy was not in what she achieved in the world of men. It was in what she had quietly changed in the world of language. There comes a time in every life when silence is no longer safe. When the hidden work done in margins, cloisters, and whispered prayers begins to ripple into the wider world. For Sister Beatrice of St. Pierre Sadives, the silence she had cultivated for so many years, the respectful hush of the scriptorium, the invisible ink of the overlooked, began to fray. It began with a letter, not addressed to her, but sent to the abbess. It came not from a bishop or cardinal, but from a neighboring abbot, a man of scholarly habits, who had once borrowed a psalter from the abbey's modest collection. The psalter, copied and annotated by Beatrice, had passed through several hands before reaching him. In the lower margin of Psalm 139, he noticed a faint comment in brown ink: Et si deus vosat per vosum femini quid tum. And if God calls through the voice of a woman, what then? To a casual reader, it might have gone unnoticed, a pious musing, perhaps a meditation inserted between verses. But the abbot was not casual, and he recognized in the phrasing an unsettling possibility that someone within the abbey, a woman, was suggesting the legitimacy of female spiritual authority. He sent the letter without fanfare and without accusation. But its implications rang clear. The abbess should look into the writings being produced in her care. An audit of theology, hidden or otherwise, might be necessary. What followed was not a scandal. There were no loud accusations, no arrests, no flames. That was not the way of quiet censure in 13th century monastic France. Instead, a stillness descended, one that was colder than the silence of the scriptorium, one that pressed on the skin like frost. The abbess, though sympathetic, was cautious. She summoned Beatrice not for interrogation, but for an evaluation, a review of her recent transcriptions. One by one, Beatrice's manuscripts were removed from the shelves. The margins were examined. The glosses were transcribed separately. The abbess read each comment without emotion, occasionally pausing to ask a question in Latin. "Why this phrasing?" she asked, pointing to a note in the book of Judith. Beatrice responded calmly. "It is the sense of the Hebrew, not a deviation, but a clarification." The abbess nodded. "And this?" A marginal gloss beside a passage in Ecclesiasticus read, "Wisdom is not only in the beards of the fathers, but in the calloused hands of the unnamed." Beatrice lowered her eyes. It seemed true. The abbess said nothing. The silence lingered. In the weeks that followed, Beatrice was asked not to return to the scriptorium. She was not forbidden, merely discouraged. Her duties shifted to more practical matters, assisting in the infirmary, tending to elderly nuns, mending worn robes. Her fingers, once accustomed to the quill and a dry scrape of parchment, now stitched wool, rubbed liniment into old joints, and poured broth into trembling hands. Some might have called it a demotion, others a quiet punishment. But Beatrice saw it for what it was, erasure without spectacle. What is most haunting about Beatrice's story is not her silencing, but how carefully it was done. There were no records of her expulsion, no formal charges of heresy, no dramatic trial. The church had long since learned that to make noise about dissent was to give it weight. Instead, her work was slowly replaced. The manuscripts she had copied were recopied, often with their marginalia removed, or the margins trimmed slightly to fit new bindings. In some cases, entire pages were recopied by novices under close supervision. Her hand was erased without needing to erase her name, because it had never officially been written. The invisible were easier to forget. The few books that escaped, either through lending or through simple oversight, became the only trace of her intellectual life. And even then, her contributions remained anonymous. To the untrained eye, they looked like common scribal notes. But to those who could read between the lines, they spoke of a mind deeply engaged in questioning the structures of faith. The wider church, meanwhile, continued its careful preservation of boundaries. Women were permitted to be nuns, yes, caretakers of the poor, preservers of relics, and singers of psalms, but thinkers, interpreters, theologians, that was not the role prescribed to them. Even abbesses who governed powerful convents rarely left a written legacy beyond administrative records. Their voices, when they spoke, were often filtered through male confessors, bishops, or chroniclers who did not record their words so much as interpret their obedience. Beatrice was never formally excommunicated. Her soul remained, officially, in good standing, but her voice did not, and that distinction, so subtle, so carefully maintained, became the template for countless other women across the centuries. In later years, as the memory of her annotations faded, Beatrice kept a private journal, not an official one, just a collection of scraps bound together with thread, hidden in a wooden box beneath the stone floor near the hearth. There she continued to write. Not theological arguments anymore. Those days had passed, but observations, questions, meditations. 1. Entry read. If a woman speaks only where she cannot be heard, is she still speaking? Another. There are truths that live in silence longer than in words. And yet another. The margins may be erased, but the hand remembers what it once wrote. These were not statements of defiance, with elegies, quiet reflections on the life she had almost lived, the question she had almost asked aloud. No grave bears Beatrice's name. Her burial was recorded in the Abbey's death ledger simply as Sora B. Obiit in Domino, Anno Domini MCC XLVI. Sister B. died in the Lord, in the year of our Lord 1246. She was laid in the ground behind the cloister, among other nuns whose names had long since faded from memory. No relics were kept, no feast day established. A church, ever efficient in its silences, ensured that nothing about her life rose loud enough to disturb the waters of tradition. But centuries later, one of her manuscripts was found in a private collection in Rouen, a fragment of the Book of Wisdom, with faint annotations in the margins beside the line. Sapientia clamatat foris. Wisdom cries out in the street was a final note. Nima responded, and no one answers. This is where we find Beatrice today, not in cathedrals or canonizations, but in the quiet folds of forgotten pages. Her story does not end with martyrdom, sainthood, or scandal. It ends, rather, with the same silence in which it began, a silence that was not empty, but full of unspoken things. And so we return to the question she once posed, quietly, in the margin of a borrowed psalter. If God calls through the voice of a woman, what then? A question still without an answer. Imagine wandering slowly through the winding cobblestones of medieval Rome. The year is uncertain, perhaps the late 1200s, teeth, perhaps the early 14th century. The city, weathered and tired, pulses with the soft rhythm of cloister bells and the shuffling steps of pilgrims. The air smells of whetstone, incense, and bread baking somewhere behind a cracked wooden door. And just past the church of San Clemente, in a shaded square with broken pavement and faded mosaics, stands a curious monument, one that most guides don't mention. It looks like a simple column at first, crowned by a rounded cap. Beneath it, etched faintly in Latin, are a few barely legible lines. Some say it was once a statue, others say it was never anything at all. But the local women, the older ones who remembered their mothers' voices, call it La Colonna della Papessa, the column of the Lady Pope. If you asked them who she was, they'd shrugged. She was real, one might say, or not real. But there used to be a statue. Now there's only this. And if you stood there long enough, letting the heat settle on your shoulders and the flies gather in lazy spirals above the fountain nearby, you might wonder what kind of statue would be removed so carefully that even its memory was quietly discouraged. That question, as old and as faint as the markings on the stone, leads us down a slow and wandering path through one of the most enduring whispered stories of church history, the tale of Pope Joan, the woman some believe reigned briefly and secretly as the only female pope. But this story is not about Joan exactly. It's about the erasures that followed her. The name Pope Joan does not appear in any official list of popes. You will not find her in the Vatican's Annuario Pontificio, nor will you see her bust among the sculpted heads that line the nave of St. Paul's Basilica. A lineup interrupted only once by a strange break in the sequence where a single name seems to have been removed. The space slightly narrowed. Her absence is her most prominent feature. But in the centuries between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the dawn of modern Catholic scholarship, her name lingered in curious places, marginal notes, travelers, tales, and even in the training rituals of newly elected popes. In some versions of the tale, she was a brilliant scholar from Mainz or Athens or somewhere equally implausible. She disguised herself as a man to enter the priesthood, rising through the ranks by sheer intellect. Eventually, through misrecognition or divine will, she became pope. Her reign was brief, perhaps 2 years. Then, according to legend, she gave birth unexpectedly and publicly during a procession between St. Peter's and the Lateran. Some say she died on the spot, others that she was stoned by the crowd. Some claim she survived, but was imprisoned in silence. Her story was repeated widely enough in the Middle Ages that even the Chronicle of Mart Evopava, a 13th century Dominican friar, records it with casual certainty. In his version, the woman, Pope is not celebrated, but used as a warning, proof that women, when they step beyond their station, bring ruin. But over time, the tale shifted from known anecdote to dangerous myth, and the church, never eager to acknowledge its uncertainties, began to gently push the story out of its official memory. And so, the statue disappeared, according to 16th century travelers. There once stood a small monument near the Via Sacra, close to the spot where the supposed birthing incident occurred. It bore no official name. Locals called it Petra Papae, the Pope's Rock. Others simply called it the Shamestone. Later writers mention a statue of a seated pope with a child at her breast, which was quietly removed in the early 1500s. But the accounts disagree. Some claim it was melted down during the renovation of the square. Others that it was relocated and quietly destroyed. A few believe it never existed at all. What's more likely is that it existed in the way many medieval monuments did, unguarded, unremarkable, and slowly absorbed into the fabric of the city until someone decided it was no longer convenient. Erasure in Rome often happened not with fanfare, but with scaffolding and silence. One moment it is there. The next you look up and it isn't. But the story did not vanish with the statue. It lived on in the rituals of power, hidden in plain sight. One of the most persistent rumors about papal coronations in the late Middle Ages involved a curious ritual, the use of a sedia stercoraria, or dung chair. This was a marble seat with a large hole in the middle, said to be used to verify the masculinity of a newly elected pope. According to this tale, Cardinal would reach beneath the chair and proclaim, Testiculos habet, et benependentis. He has testicles, and they hang well. This absurd image has been dismissed by most modern scholars as satire or anti-clerical mockery, and yet the chair exists. You can see it today in the Vatican museums. It is beautifully carved, polished, and features a large circular opening at its base. Was it a toilet, a throne, a birthing seat, or a reminder? Whatever its function, the chair's continued presence and the rituals that once surrounded it suggest that for centuries, the idea of a female pope was not simply a legend, but a possibility worth guarding against. It is in this atmosphere of ambiguity and buried memory that we meet our central figure, Medela della Torre, a widowed midwife from the Trastevere district of Rome. She is not a well-documented person. There are no letters bearing her name, no chronicles that describe her life in detail. But her story, like the statue, lingers in fragments in a 15th century legal ledger housed in the Vatican archives. There is a fine recorded against a woman of that name for mocking the Holy Father's memory. In the margin, a scribe has added, "Et in vicinia papaci, loquens," speaking in the vicinity of the popes. This is not much. A name, a charge, a location for those who study forgotten histories. It is a thread, and when we follow that thread, slowly, without hurry, it leads us not to the Vatican, but to a narrow lane near the old Jewish quarter, where midwives practiced their craft far from the eyes of bishops. Madelina, we believe, told stories, not sermons, not heresies, but stories, to her daughter, to her neighbors, to the pregnant women she helped deliver. She spoke of the popes as not as a warning, but as a possibility, a moment, however fleeting when the robes fit differently. She may have pointed to the statue before it was gone. She may have said, "There, that's where it happened." And then, one day, the statue was gone, and she was summoned, not to trial, just to pay a fine. But in the fine is a clue, a signal that the church, even centuries later, was still nervous about the idea. of a woman in the papal chair, and that those who remembered her, the column, the statue, the ritual, would be quietly asked to forget. Madela lived out her life in obscurity. She continued delivering children. Her name appears once more in a baptismal register 10 years later, listed as a godmother. After that, nothing. She did not challenge the church. She did not write letters to Rome. She simply remembered. And for that, she was marked lightly, but clearly, as someone who had wandered too close to the boundaries of Cloyes, heard what history was allowed to say. Her presence is a reminder that history is not only what is written, but what is allowed to remain written. So we return to the square, the one near San Clemente, where the column now stands, alone and anonymous. No one points to it anymore. The tourists pass by. The guides talk of emperors, of saints, of martyrdoms, but the column remains, and if you pause beside it, letting your eyes trace the faint groove where a name may once have been carved, you might wonder, what kind of memory survives best? The one etched in stone, or the one passed from mouth to mouth, mother to daughter, midwife to child? And if a statue disappears, but the story remains, was it ever truly erased? If you return to the faded Roman quarter where the monument used to stand, or where it might have stood, you'll find the buildings a little crooked, leaning into one another like old friends. Time has softened the edges. Brick walls buckle gently outward. Ivy has crept into corners that once housed shrines, market stalls, or bits of forgotten marble. And down one narrow alley, whose name changes slightly in every old map, stands a low archway that used to belong to the midwives' guild. The guild no longer meets. It hasn't for centuries. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was one of the few formal bodies in the city where women had a recognized professional voice. Their job was not simply to deliver babies, but to bear witness, to record in small, ink-stained registers who was born, who survived, who died, and to whom those lives belonged in this role. Women like Madela della Torre were not just practical guides through childbirth. They were keepers of unofficial history. They knew, often before anyone else, who had given birth in secret, who had taken holy vows but found themselves mysteriously pregnant, who was whispered to be a bishop's lover, or a cardinal's niece, or a laundress who bore too many resemblances to a priest. And among these women, stories traveled, not in books, not in church, but in hushed conversations over steaming cloths and shallow birthing basins, in quiet cups of broth delivered after labor, in fingers dipped into holy water just before pushing, in nods exchanged when someone mentioned her, the woman who had worn the papal crown, the woman whose name was never said too loudly by the late Middle Ages. The story of Pope Joan had entered an odd gray zone between belief and disavowal. In the north, especially in Germany, where versions of her tale had first flourished, chroniclers still referred to her, even if cautiously. In Italy, the clergy grew more nervous. In 1375, the Dominican Jean de Mailly, writing from Metz, still included her in his list of popes, sandwiched quietly between Leo IV and Benedict III. But his church politics grew more tense and papal authority more contested, especially during the Great Schism and the Avignon papacy. Anything that made the Holy See appear uncertain became dangerous, and so Joan became a threat, not just because of what she might have done, but because of what her memory might suggest, that the papal institution was vulnerable, that a mistake could have happened, that a woman, in secret, might have risen through the most male-dominated office in Christendom. Some historians argue the entire legend is a medieval fabrication, a way, perhaps, to criticize the corruption of the church under a thin veil of allegory. Others suggest Joan was a literary invention, satire that got out of hand, but too many early references exist. scattered, hard to date, inconsistent, but real to dismiss the story entirely as a Renaissance hoax. What we are left with is a puzzle. Why did the story appear in so many places before the church began to refute it? And why, more curiously, did the refutations come not with excommunication or denial, but with silence? If Joan had never existed, if the story were merely slander or fiction, its Vatican, with its immense resources and appetite for theological precision, could have wiped it clean, condemned it, declared it heretical. Instead, it removed a statue, erased a line, let the ritual disappear, and occasionally fined a midwife for mentioning the wrong name in the wrong place. In the 15th century, a visiting scholar named Adam of USK wrote briefly of a marble monument to the woman pope near the Church of St. Sixtus. He offered no proof, no sketch, but his mention aligns with other accounts that reference similar landmarks, unnamed, undescribed, but always there, like an itch on the historical record. Travelers from Bohemia, Germany, and even parts of France recounted tales of a site where a pope once fell, not figuratively, not literally, when labor pains struck in the street, and here, buried in these repeated images of stumbling, collapsing, falling down in public, we begin to glimpse what made the story so powerful. Joan's fall was not just the exposure of a secret, it was the collapse of an entire structure of belief, because if the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, could not only be mistaken, but could give birth in front of the Roman faithful, what else might the Church have misunderstood? This was the danger Madalina's generation inherited. A story too persistent to be deleted, a rumor too vivid to fully deny, and yet it's too dangerous to be affirmed. So it became a secret history. A tradition passed not in books, but in rituals, of omission, in the sudden disappearance of a statue, in the decision to skip a name in the list of popes, in the retelling of birth stories, always secondhand, always shrouded in phrases like "they say" or "it is said," and perhaps most of all, is in the continued anxiety surrounding the presence of women in sacred space. There is another curious ritual that began to fade around this time, the procession from the Lateran Palace to St. Peter's Basilica on the day of papal enthronement. It is this very procession, according to the legend, where John went into labor by the 15th century. The route of the procession had changed. Some say it was for convenience, others for security, but among local records, there's a small note in the margin of a civic planner's handbook from 1461. The route by the Street of the Popes is no longer to be used. Let it be marked with silence. A strange phrase, marked with silence. It is not the sort of thing officials usually write, but it lingers, like a suggestion or a warning. And so the path itself became an absence, a negative space in the choreography of papal ritual. As the Renaissance bloomed, and humanist scholars turned toward classical texts and official histories, stories like Pope Jones were dismissed as medieval superstition. The Church grew more confident in its authority. Statues of classical figures reappeared. The papal tiara became more ornate, and the story of Joan faded from high circles of discourse, but in the homes of midwives and laundresses. In corners of Rome, untouched by marble restoration and theological debate, her memory clung to life, and sometimes it slipped back into public view. In 1557, a Venetian printer issued a book of oddities, De Rerum Memorabilibus, in which a short chapter recalled the Lady Pope, whose fate was concealed by the Church. The book was promptly banned. Its author was reprimanded, though not excommunicated. And again, the story was not denounced, simply discouraged. Silence, it seemed, was more effective than condemnation. Which brings us back to Madalina. By now, she is older. Her name no longer appears in city ledgers. But we know her daughter lived on, because her name is Abetadella. Tor is recorded as a witness in a small inheritance dispute in 1483, and listed next to her name. Under occupation is the word lev at rice.midwife. One generation to the next. The story, though forbidden, was never entirely lost, not because it was believed, but because it was remembered. There is an old Roman proverb that says, "Stone remembers longer than ink." But sometimes, when the stones are scraped clean and the inscriptions vanish, it is ink, or voices, or the soft repetition of bedtime stories that preserves what history tries to forget. So we return to the square, the one where a monument might have stood. A single column remains. No plaque, no explanation. People pass by without noticing. And yet, space hums, as if waiting for someone to remember what was once carved there, waiting for someone to ask, what would it have meant? Truly, if the story of the popes were not a fable, but a fact that once had a statue. More importantly, why, even now, are we still so afraid to ask? The wind changes direction often in Rome. One day, it rolls down from the north, brushing over the Vatican rooftops with a dry hush. Another day, it coils up from the Tiber, pulling the scent of damp stone and buried centuries with it. Somewhere between these two currents, stories drift. Not loudly, not like declarations or proclamations, but like dust. It's quiet, almost weightless, yet persistent. This is how the story of the woman who was once called Pope continued to live, not in the books of canon law, nor etched in the marble of basilicas, but in a chain of recollections whispered through centuries. And sometimes, almost by accident, she surfaced in the mid-17th century. A curious thing happened. A Jesuit scholar by the name of Leo, the lazy keeper of the Vatican Library, began compiling a massive catalog of papal biographies. Meticulous, cautious, and fiercely loyal to the church, Alexius had access to a great deal of documentation that no one else saw. He never mentioned Pope John outright in his published works, but in his private notes found after his death, there are two references. One is a short, irritated line that reads, "No need to address the woman who appears in the German stories. She is an error in sequence, not worthy of refutation." And the other, far more telling, says simply, "The statue near the Street of the Shoemakers was moved. The pedestal was left empty." It is unclear whether Alexius meant this as a passing note about urban reorganization or a sly reference to something more uncomfortable. But in both cases, he did not say it wasn't true. He only chose not to write more. He chose silence. This strategy of omission rather than confrontation was not unique to Alexius. Over the centuries, many churchmen, chroniclers, and historians who believed Joan never existed still felt it best not to say so too loudly. To bring her up at all was to give her life. It's better, they thought, to let her fade, let her dissolve into rumor. But the thing about stories passed down through people rather than paper is that they often prove harder to erase. In 1675, a French traveler named Du Breuil visited Rome and wrote in his diary about being shown a stone chair with a hole in it, once used for verifying a pope's masculinity. The chair, he said, was displayed with some embarrassment in a quiet corner of the Vatican's archives. This object, the so-called sedia stercoraria, was long rumored to be the last surviving remnant of the Pope Joan scandal. According to one version of the legend, after Joan's unexpected childbirth, the church began to physically confirm that each new pope was male by seating him on a stone throne with a strategically placed opening. Modern scholars generally dismiss this tale as apocryphal or satirical. The chair itself was most likely a Roman birthing seat or even a commode misinterpreted by later visitors. Yet, the association persisted for centuries, became one more way the church's architecture began to carry the shadow of a story it refused to acknowledge, a shadow you can still visit. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers began to treat the Pope Joan story not as scandal, but as curiosity. Voltaire, in his typically cutting fashion, referred to her in his philosophical dictionary as a tale told by fools to amuse themselves between chapters of doctrine. Others, like Diderot and Montesquieu, were more subtle, treating Joan as a symbol of the absurdities they saw in religious bureaucracy. But even their dismissals kept her name alive. And strangely, as reason grew and superstition shrank, Joan found new listeners not among the devout, but among the curious. Writers, painters, teachers, people were less interested in whether she truly ruled the war Crute than in why such a story could not be forgotten. The 19th century saw a brief revival of interest in her legend, as national movements across Europe began reclaiming or reimagining historical figures for their own purposes. Joan appeared in odd places. In Germany, where the Protestant movement had long used her as evidence of papal corruption, she featured in satire and school books alike. In England, she became a shorthand for clerical hypocrisy. Even in Italy, where the church's influence remained strongest, her memory flickered. A short-lived pamphlet printed in Bologna in 1843, titled "On the Possibility of a Woman Pope," was confiscated within weeks, but not before it had reached readers in Florence and Turin. Meanwhile, midwives still passed on her story, softened, now blurred around the edges, but always lingering. She rode in white, they'd say, and she stumbled. The details changed with the telling, but the arc remained the same. A woman rose in secret, ruled in silence, fell in pain, and was never mentioned again. There is an account, possibly apocryphal, of a nun in Avignon who, in the 1820s, painted a tiny figure in papal robes into the margin of her illuminated book of hours. The figure is unmistakably female. No name is written. It's just a gold halo, a red cloak, and a line beneath in delicate Latin. She knew the scriptures better than the cardinals. The book was seized during a monastery inventory in 1834 and quietly disappeared from public view. We don't know the nun's name or why she painted the figure, what it meant to her, but we know she did it, and that, perhaps, is the clearest expression of what Pope Joan became over time. Not a confirmed imposter, but a mirror, a reflection of what institutions try not to see. A story not meant to be believed, but not quite allowed to be forgotten. In the 20th century, scholars became more systematic in their exploration of the legend. Theologians, feminists, and folklorists all weighed in. Some tried to trace the story to earlier sources, suggesting it may have begun as a garbled misunderstanding of a Pope John who was unusually weak or reclusive. Others argued that the Church's frantic attempts to erase her point to her existence more than her absence. Still others suggested that the tale functioned as a kind of cultural pressure, valve a way for people frustrated with church power to imagine its undoing, not through war or protest, but through birth, a quiet, messy, undeniable fact, even now. In the 21st century, Pope Joan lives on in the margins. There have been novels, stage plays, even films, and while most of these veer into fiction or speculation, they signal something important. The story still matters. In 2009, an excavation under a street near the Church of San Clemente uncovered fragments of an old statue basets plaque, scraped clean, its dimensions matching those described by 15th century travelers. Archaeologists made no formal connection to the legend, but among local tour guides, the location is now included in whispered references on late night walking tours. They don't say she was real, only that she was remembered. And that brings us to the final question. What does it mean when a figure, perhaps imaginary, perhaps really is remembered, not for what she did, but for what others refused to say? Why was she erased? And why did that erasure fail? In history, there are names that echo loudly, tied to power and conquest. But there are also names that linger softly, like a half-heard melody, never quite resolved. Pope Jonah, whoever she might have been, one of the latter. Her story does not fit neatly into doctrine or archive, but it fits perfectly into the quiet spaces between the ones left open, so that even